Hi, this is Jowie Malovhele, your transformational coach. Soul Anchor welcomes you to our YouTube channel. Today I want to talk about the 4 generations because there's a domino effect with the 4 generations. When I talk about the 4 generations, I refer to my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, and me. What I've learned about the 4 generations is who I become, who I am today, can be traced back to the 4 generations. Because my great-grandmother raised my grandmother raised my mother raised me. Today, I'm raising my sons. I caught from my mother. Other than catching from my mother, I was raised by my grandmother, my mother's adoptive mother. Throughout my life, I have seen patterns that I adopted and imported from my grandmother and my mother. My question is to you, what have you caught? What have you imported? Because there is. It could be good, it could be great, it could be not so great. In this way, there are pathologies that needs to be cleaned out in the 4 generations. You can stay there or you can break the cycle. I want to show you this. The choices that you make today can be influenced by the 4 generations. What were the family values that your great-grandmother upheld? I don't know my great-grandmothers. I don't know their stories. I know parts of my grandmother's story, who raised my mom. My dad's mom passed on when my dad was 6. I never knew her. I only knew my grandmother from my mother's side and my mother. But then I don't know what my great-grandmother's family values were. I know a bit about my grandmother's family values because I grew up there until I was in primary school. When I started primary school, I was babysitted there throughout the day. I went to creche in Chawero, where my grandmother lived, and my parents worked, so she was my nanny. But when I started school, I was with my parents full time. So I know about my family values where I grew up. And I've learned that I've imported some of those family values into my own family. These things happen whether we like it or not. Now, this is what I want to ask you. Does your own family values represent you? Or they represent the values where you grew up? Oftentimes, it's those things that we don't look at. As I'm talking, I want you to note the questions. Remember, we work from our books. Your choices, do they represent your values today? The choices that you make each day, what do they represent? If you look at them very well, if you were to dissect them, I can guarantee you will see a reflection of the 4 generations in some of your choices. Now, let me bring it home to you. Let me tell you my story. I'm a storyteller. I love telling stories. I believe that people identify with stories. And for me, it's not just telling a story, but it's telling my story to help others transform and transcend because they can identify with my story. I have learned to be vulnerable. so that in that vulnerability, I can help others to be vulnerable. In that vulnerability, there is empathy. So I want you to learn from my story. My grandmother was a perfectionist. I grew up in her home, and I see some of the perfectionist traits in my life today. In my grandmother's home, everything was black and white. There was no spontaneity, routine. Remember, at some point in their lives, they worked as domestic workers. They worked where, they were laborers. And there were routines. In my grandmother's house, there was a basin that the children used. Mukulu's basin, her basin. Breakfast was eaten at a certain time, lunch at a certain time, dinner at a certain time. And there were etiquettes that were followed. Everything was structured. They had so many beautiful, fruit trees. But even when the fruits were ripe, there was a time to harvest. Even if you see that beautiful apple on a tree, you couldn't pick it. You had to wait until it's time to pick it. Now, let's look at my life. Perfectionism became another face of shame for me. Ask me why I say a face of shame. Perfectionism for other people is beautiful. They become go-getters because of perfectionism. They become go-getters because of what they were told growing up. Sometimes you can have a very successful business empire, but what drove it is because growing up you were told you couldn't fail. You had to hold the torch. You were that trailblazer for your family. You had to grow up and assume roles you were not ready for because the family needed you. That's, for me, I call that beautiful face of brokenness. We achieve sometimes with brokenness as our source. Now, my perfectionism. Then, my mother duplicated what she was taught by my grandmother. Our home was a show house. It was that home that everybody in Pimville, Zone 4, in our section, looked up to. We were kids that were raised to behave in a certain way. It was beautiful. But then, how we were raised, other parents commended. Other parents commended. In my home, everything was clean. My mom had white and blue tiles in the kitchen. When I got married, those tiles were still like that. Everything had its place, everything was clean. I learned to cook very early on in my life. I learned to do household chores perfectly very early on in my life. However, that perfectionism, I traced it back and I learned that it was not only my mother. My father had it too. Because at some point in his life, he had to go work. When he was still young, after his mother died. I learned that my father started grade 1 after a brief stint of working as a laborer, meaning that he was a bit older when he was in grade 1. Then, something once happened to me when I was young. I was in grade 1 when I struggled to do my alphabet, A to Z, because I was very playful. Then I was punished. Then I learned everything I did, I had to deliver and deliver well. That became the standard for me. However, the face of shame became the fact that when I didn't achieve that standard, self-worth was the cost I had to pay. My worth was at stake. I was not good enough. And I had to do more. I had to try harder each time to ensure that what I delivered was perfect. I struggled with self-worth. I struggled with it because each time my world was perfect. There was no if and but. As an adult today, my husband often laughs at me. He is spontaneous. I am more structured, systematic. He calls me a to-do list girl because remember routine growing up. I struggled to break away from it. I went for counseling. I had to learn to leave my shoes in the lounge as part of the activities that I learned from counseling, to leave my shoes in the lounge and not pick them up until the second day. Boy, it was a very difficult exercise. Every time I saw my shoes under the table, they didn't belong there. But I had to teach myself to say, you know what, girl, it's okay. It's okay. They didn't belong at your home. They didn't belong in your grandmother's home, but they belong in your home. They belong in your home. I would look at a lunch bar, at the tills, and resist buying it because it was not good for me. It was not good for me. I had to learn. I remember for 3 weeks, my counselor kept asking me, did you eat the lunch bar? I drove with it. I looked at it each day. I couldn't eat it. Until finally, I had half of it and gave the other half to my helper. I ate the half of it. It wasn't good for me. That's how structured things were for me. Eating that lunch bar that day, leaving my shoes, were some of the things that helped me break away from the structure. When I registered at varsity, the day I registered was the day I passed. I had to work hard because you know what? There's a standard I had set for myself and I had to achieve it. If I don't, I struggled. I remember this other time in varsity, I wrote the test, finished writing the test, and yet there was one question at the back that I didn't see, 10 marks. When we were done, then others were discussing that difficult question. I'm thinking, no way, was there a question like that? Then they showed me, boom, it was at the back. That thing killed me. Why could I miss that? I missed 100%. And this could have been a walk in the park for me. That opened me up to writing exams and not leaving the exam room. Even when I was done with a 3-hour paper in 2 hours, I will sit thinking, what if? What if? Until it was time to leave, I never left the exam room. I kept reading and rereading and reading and rereading to make sure I had everything. And as a result, I would mark my own script as I went through it. I knew how many marks I got from that test. And funny enough, when I got my script, after having missed the 10 marks at the back, I was still tops in my class. Some people might think, you know what, it's beautiful. But then I paid the price. Another phase of shame. Each time I pushed myself to be on top of my game. It's beautiful. However, I had to learn to redeem it. I had to learn to break the pathology. I struggle every day because you know what? I have learned that even though my mind may forget, my feelings don't. They remember the pathway. And each time I default to factory settings for generations. I have to remind myself, like today, not to clean my house, not to touch anything. Because you know what? I was raised in a clean house. There are times when I have to remind myself not to work. When I haven't worked at home, when I haven't done something constructive, something measurable, I feel like I've wasted time. I learned to maximize time in such a way that when I'm in the toilet, I'm reading. I'm always doing something. That's why I tell you that, you know what? It's a daily struggle. I have to relearn certain patterns of behavior because from the 4 generations, there's learned behaviors. And these are learned behaviors that manifest each day in my life. I have to remind myself to say, you know what, Joey, it's okay. You've put out, you've given out all of you in it. It's okay to give you an hour and just to go enjoy TV. Sometimes 2 months would go by without me watching TV because I'm busy. I'm maximizing time. I saw how hard my mother worked. I saw how hard my grandmother worked to keep it all together. I don't know about my great-grandmother. Then, my choices were influenced, shaped, and impacted by what I caught growing up. Was it what I wanted? I don't know. Probably not. But I didn't know any better. Because I didn't know any better, I guess it's what I wanted. But when I started opening myself up to learning, unlearning, and relearning, then I was able to take a sieve and subject some of the things of the 4 generations to the sieve. Yes, some parts I succeeded. Some parts, daily struggle. It's a daily challenge because you know what? I always default to what my system knows, what my feelings remember. If Joey doesn't clean the house, Joey is gonna hear her mother's voice. And you know what? My mother could talk. My mother could complain for a long time. Then I would hear that voice, then stand up and go do something because I just couldn't give myself rest. The 4 generations. I grew up seeing it. And I became it, whether I liked it or not, whether I was aware or not. But every day I know I have a challenge to redeem from the 4 generations what I don't want to manifest in my life. Because if I don't break the cycle, I'm bound to continue it with my sons. I'm bound to continue it with my sons. And my sons will continue. They will continue it with their children. And it just becomes a domino effect. Now, I want to ask you this. As much as I came from a perfect home, I came from a very loving home. My mother was very generous, beautiful heart. My grandmother was very generous too, very loving, beautiful heart. Just like my mother, I became the same. However, they were more disciplinarian. They were more disciplinarian. It was about right and wrong, black and white, than it was about fun. The same thing I did when my kids were younger, until I started reading and working on my parenting. If I didn't do that, I would have just continued. But reading, learning, unlearning, and relearning helped me see that, you know what, I can teach, train in a very nurturing way. Because for me, priority became my son's hearts than what needs to be done. Breaking the cycle enabled me to invest more in the heart. Because investing in the heart is investing in the being. I want to challenge you today to say, look at your own life. Look at your own life. There are things that you adopted and have imported today into your generation. And because today you may be raising your own kids, be aware that it will go to that generation. I had self-destructive patterns. Self-destructive patterns. Because you know what? I didn't know how to give myself grace. Perfection and grace, two different stories. Giving yourself grace, it's like compromising something. Now, in the daily struggle, I am learning to say, if Joey has decided to rest, Joey doesn't go to the mall. Going to the mall is working. Joey must just chill. Yes, in that chilling period, it's a struggle still. I must hold my horses each time to say, girl, you're resting. Leave that, leave that, leave that. Rest. And I'm teaching myself to rest without feeling guilty that I didn't maximize time. That's how the 4 generations affect us. That's how they affect the woman I am today. And I want you to know that it is a daily struggle. It's a daily challenge. It needs that awareness and recognition that I came from this system. Decide the system for myself. Carve a path from, the family tree. I have to branch away. Create my own branch. Work on my own branch so that I can break some patterns of behavior. I bring with me what belongs, my choice in my today and my branch, my own family branch, my values that will become my son's values. I do not want my sons to live with the shame of perfection. I have lived with it. For me, it was about the measurables in my life. That's what mattered. It was about the scores than the mistakes. Mistakes were unwelcome. They were a no-no. Now, as I close, I want to challenge you. Take your book. Now, here's the question. Do your choices represent your values? And your values, where do they come from? How do they look like? What shapes and informs how they look like? Your choice or what you caught? Is it working for you? Is it something that you would like to impart? Is it something that you would like to import to your children? I have learned not to import what didn't work for me. I have learned not to export it. That's why for me, it's very important to work on my soul each day. Because each day, it's a struggle. Those things don't just go away. As much as I am saved, I'm a child of God, I'm a Christian, I've got a relationship with God that I love and treasure. Brokenness, it's not automatic in terms of breaking it and dealing with the solution. You need to be intentional about it. Your choice versus what you caught. Now, I replaced self-worth with Christ's worth. And I remind myself each day to say, you know what, girl, you are enough. Whether you achieved today, you didn't achieve the stile tomorrow. Don't be too hard on yourself. Oh, by the way, what you had set out to achieve today, all those things on your to-do list, do they matter? Focus on what matters. Love yourself more to be gracious to yourself. Life is not about perfectionism. I am perfected in Christ. So now, I want you to take your own journey. Look at how the 4 generations have affected the man or the woman you are today. I want you to identify pathologies in the 4 generations, how you relate with people, how you conduct relationships today, who you are becoming each day, the choices that you make, everything about you. I want you to go back. I want you to reflect. And when I talk about reflecting, I mean coming outside of yourself, looking inside of you, for you to see the patterns of the 4 generations. Break the cycle. Every day, it's a learning opportunity. Every day, it's there for me to learn to love myself enough to give myself grace than to be beating myself up because I didn't measure the measurables. This is a challenge to you too, as much as it remains my challenge. And I'm intentional. And I work on it with intentionality and so much zeal, and remind myself, it's okay. It's okay. Be proud to be. It's not what you do, but who you are becoming. And in who you are becoming, let it be about your choice. God has given you a power of will, a power to choose. Choose wisely. Choose to rise up. There are beautiful things in the 4 generations, but there are also things that don't belong in your generation today. Thank you for watching.